Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to CLS2015M. This week's lecture, as you obviously are getting used to, is going to be done online. So I'm putting this online ahead of the seminars, and I've set some reading, which you should find in the Blackboard site. So there should be two PDFs there, and I've asked you to read Winkler's chapter 1, I think, and there's a seminar worksheet there with some questions that you might want to use to think a little bit more about epic films. However, in today's lecture, what I want to do is give you an introduction to the ways in which the ancient world has been represented in film, why I think that matters, and how it relates to the present. So I'm going to be talking a lot about presentism and why they're back and why epic films treat the ancient world as they do. My background, as you'll probably be able to see from the opening slide, is in media and cultural studies. So I actually work in film and television, video games and social media, and the ways in which they represent history. A lot of the specializations I've used are the Middle Ages, particularly medieval film, but I have written quite a bit about the ancient world and the ways in which we come to see that world as a representation, perhaps more so than we would experience it as a representation of the textual worlds that you're encountering, or even those worlds as they've evolved through the other centuries. My main focus is going to be on using two different time frames here. So the first one, I'm going to be looking at the ancient world, and I've got really no expertise in the classical era. So I'm going to be looking at the ancient world as like one big mass, right? As ancient Rome, ancient Greece, and the biblical world, all as one kind of homogeneous mass. Now, I appreciate historically that it's very, very irresponsible. But what I want to do is, the reason I'm thinking it in those ways is because when we come to represent it in film particularly, those do tend to become blended. So there's a line by Derek Elliott where he says, in Derek Elliott's book, The Epic Film, where he says the biblical world and the Greco-Roman world all become merged into one as like one kind of paste that then gets spread more thinly in the modern era of cinema. So that's the reason why I look at those in the way that I do. I look at them as kind of one indistinguishable mass, because I'm also really interested not in the question of accuracy, which you'll see in a moment why I don't think accuracy is a particularly useful way of looking at representations of the ancient world, but why I look at the question of authenticity rather than accuracy. And I'll explain a little bit more what I mean about the difference between those two in a moment. But for our purposes, for the introduction, what I want you to think about is not whether they get the costumes right or the buildings right or whether the weaponry is correct and so on. But what I want to think about is that kind of spirit, that zeitgeist, that feeling of authenticity and where that comes from. Because if we think about authenticity rather than accuracy, as I'll talk about in a moment, we realize that authenticity is us and what we bring to the film, whereas accuracy is about what the filmmaker, or how closely the filmmaker aligns with what we think the truth was, and that's a lot more problematic. So I've broken this lecture into 3 sections. It'll probably end up being about 40-45 minutes. I'll edit it down later to try and make it as close to that as possible. But obviously the great advantage of the video lecture over the physical lecture is you can pause it. So I probably will go a little bit faster than I usually go, and I might be referring to some texts as I go through, and if there are texts that are available through the library, I'll try and put a link into the video at the specific moment to tell you where you can find out more if you're interested in that area. So I'm going to break it into 3 sections. One is looking at the epic film itself and how we define the epic, what it means in terms of genre, in terms of history, in terms of its rise and fall in the 20th and 21st century. Then I'll look at the ways in which we represent the ancient world, particularly through film, but also some of those arguments will apply to TV, because we've seen in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, we've seen this explosion of kind of Greco-Roman TV, so things like Spartacus and so on, and Rome, the BBC's Rome. In the third section, I will actually look at the film Gladiator, and I'll try and to take apart the film to show you exactly what I mean, how it's doing the things that I'm arguing take place more broadly with the epic films. And I'll finish up with some conclusions that should hopefully lead you into the seminar. So let's start with the definitions and what we mean by the epic films. I've included the PDF to the, which is the introduction to my book on the epic film, which actually has about 20 pages trying to talk about how we define epic. No one is really particularly sure about what we mean, but we do sort of recognize it when we see it. In general, we're talking about those films that are large scale, high production value, high concept. So that's a Hollywood term to me, kind of it's not about one person's struggle against a particular relationship or circumstance or whatever. It's about how one person's struggle actually maps kind of the birth of a nation or maps a foundation myth or so on. We're usually talking about something in the Greco-Roman biblical world, even if that's like a fantasy world, a bit like 300 or Clash of the Titans. Even if it is more of a fantasy world, we're talking about that sort of era, that very mythical era. And we're going to be talking usually nowadays about a widescreen film. That's certainly since the 1950s, since the invention of the anamorphic lens in 1943. And we'll expect casts of thousands. We'll expect a lot of sex. We'll expect a lot of war. We'll expect fortunes to be won or lost. And very often, as Robert Burgoyne talks about, we'll see the ways in which the hero's struggle is mapped against that of a nation. So what we see is a sense of an expression of nationality and nationalism, which is really, really important for the era in which they're released rather than the one they're trying to represent. So if we use that running definition of the epic film, we can see that actually the epic film comes and goes. So it comes and goes in these cycles. It emerges in very, very soon after the development of the cinema. So some of the very first films could be seen in some ways as epic, but certainly by the 1914, 1915 era, people like Giovanni Pastroni have been making films like Cabiria, which is often seen as one of the biggest and earliest epic films. Hugely expensive film. It's lavish sets about Babylon. And this sort of rises, becomes more and more popular through the late 1915 to 1920 era. This is the era, of course, before the invention of synchronized sound. So we've got these big film scores that go alongside them. And then suddenly in the sort of the 1930s, just before the Second World War, they just completely disappear. So they're really, really popular in that interwar period, 1915 to 1939. And then they suddenly disappear. Then they start to emerge again. 1948, 1949, we've got Cecil B. DeMille doing the Ten Commandments, Samson and Delilah, and then the explosion of The Robe. The Robe was really the film in 1953 that launches everything. The film is a CinemaScope film, so it's 2.35 to 1. It's massively widescreen film, and this is the thing that launches the epic film for the 1950s. They dominate the 1950s to the extent that Karl Maurer talks about it as the dominant film form. He says it was during the Eisenhower era of the 1950s that the Hollywood historical epic regained favour. He immediately ties that to the contextual, or to the conservatism of the period. He says it's a very conservative period, and the Hollywood epic presents an essentially conservative view of the ancient world. This is what Maurer calls the golden age of Hollywood Roman epics, which he says starts with Quo Vadis in 1951, but I actually have disagreed in some of the things I've written and suggest it's closer to 1953 when it really starts to gain traction. And in fact, Quo Vadis did reasonably well, but it was The Robe that exploded the popularity. They come in the 1920s and then they go again. Then they emerge in the 1940s into the 1960s. 1965, thereabouts, they just die. With the Greatest Story Ever Told and The Fall of the Roman Empire, appropriately, the expensive films completely disappear. And we don't hear again from them until 2000 with the re-emergence of Gladiator, which is why I've picked that film as the film I'd like you to focus on for the seminars. So we see that these are what are called the two golden ages of the peplum, and you'll see it referred to in some of the writing as the peplum film, and by that they very often mean the sword and sandal or the Hollywood epic. We see that during the silent period and then the 1940s to 60s, and we see, even if we're not sure what an epic film is, we know that these are the peak periods, because we measure it by the ways in which the same type of film was made again and again over a period of years, right? This is what Michel Lagny, in his definition of the peplum, calls it. He says the same types of film are made again and again over a period of years. Mass production of this kind is justified only when attendances generate healthy profit, and it ceases as soon as profits fall off. So we see that they kind of come and they go and then they suddenly disappear. When Gladiator comes back, film studies has become established as a discipline, and so one of the first questions that people were really fascinated by was why? Why is Gladiator suddenly back? Because, of course, for 30 years or so, no one had seen a film at the cinema like this. No one had dared to make a big-budget Hollywood film of that scale depicting the ancient world. Some small things had appeared on TV, some small versions like Clash of the Titans in 1981, the Louis Leterrier version. But there's nothing really of that scale or quality. I mean, the critics were united that this was the film that relaunches the epic. So Martin Winkler, in the reading that you've been reading, calls it the first ancient epic produced for the silver screen since the mid-1960s. Absolutely no question about it. Solomon, in the same volume, calls it the first heroic tragedy on cinema screen set in the Greco-Roman world at the turning point of 2 millennia. Winkler, again, in a different publication, calls it the giant box office success that has suddenly made epic cinema a promising venue for commercial filmmaking. So not only is he saying it's bringing it back, but he's also giving it the credit for the explosion of epic films that followed for the sort of 15 years, and it lasted till about 2015. This explosion of cinema. And in fact, Jeffrey Richards, who you'll see quite a lot of quotations from Jeffrey Richards, because I've also included a reading from him in the Blackboard. He's one of the experts in this area. He says the astonishing worldwide success of Ridley Scott's Gladiator single-handedly revived a cinematic genre that had been moribund for 35 years. And again, he too suggests that somehow the success of Gladiator was what prompted other filmmakers to go back and make more. So throughout the literature, we're certainly agreed, even if we don't know what the epic is, we know that the epic comes and goes in cycles, that's point one. We know that it is recognizable because lots of films of the same type get made, that's point two. They're usually set in a kind of a vaguely Greco-Roman biblical world, that's point three. And we also see them as being united by a similar way of viewing that world, or a similar idea of viewing that world. So, the question about why they come and go is a really, really important one. I've offered a number of definitions. First of all, I'm suggesting that we're talking about genre, and so genre films always come and go. Christian Metz, who's a film theorist, has this theory about genre cycles. He says that genres always come and go in cycles. So like the Western will dominate the cinema, and then will disappear, and will come back in a slightly different form, and then will dominate, and will disappear in a slightly different form. We're seeing this at the moment with the superhero films and the Marvel stuff and so on, which, you know, may seem like it's been around forever, but it won't. It hasn't, and it won't be. It really took a while to get traction, and it took over from the epic films in the late sort of 2000s, about 2008, 2009. We start seeing the superhero films and the Marvel films. They're going to disappear almost certainly within the next sort of 3 to 5 years. It'll be replaced with something else, and that will then dominate. We'll get the romantic comedies back maybe, and so on. And so what we'll see, so we see that genres in themselves are naturally parts of cycles. So that's partly why they'll come and go. Number two is technology. Technology is really, really important in the coming and going, or the peaks and the troughs of the epic film, because these films are films that cost a lot of money, right? But they also are dependent on massive technological effects, special effects. I've written about special effects in the book that I've put up there. They're also expensive films, and they use a lot of technology in terms of their lenses, so anamorphic lenses, which were interestingly developed actually during the First World War by a guy called Henri Chrétien, who develops them for tanks. So it's a way of, it's a lens that is kind of a widescreen lens that allows you to see out of a turret of a tank and be able to see sort of a wider panorama. That then gets used as a way of recording through the camera, and then reversed essentially, so they're projected back onto the big screen. So the development of technology in the late 1940s allows the epic film to come back, and we see again the massive leaps that took place with CGI, computer generated image images in cinema in the late 1990s that'll have things like Titanic and Walking with Dinosaurs and Jurassic Park, and therefore brought about the success of Gladiator. So the technology is another part. The timing is a third aspect, which is that we kind of want them, right? So for filmmakers who hadn't seen these films since the 1960s, there's a sense of nostalgia. Well, not just for filmmakers, for audiences, sorry. There's a sense of nostalgia in watching these films that were familiar to them from their youth. I mentioned in my announcement last week that that Easter time was always the time for watching epic films, and you may have seen that there were Ten Commandments and The Robe, and I think Spartacus, or was it Ben-Hur? Very traditionally, you'll see those films. King of Kings, a great story ever told, are very traditional to screen in at Easter time. The final element of why they come and go is because, in a sense, they do something for us. And this is the theory of presentism that I said I would suggest. Jeffrey Richards and I have both argued independently and together that these films do something for us in the present, not for them in the past. They do nothing for the ancient world, obviously, but they do nothing really for the memory or the celebration of the ancient world, except perhaps I think they do inspire some classicists to go and study the things that they do study. But they are also always doing something for us. They are also always, in some ways, a kind of mythical device. And in fact, this is what Konstantin Santas in his book, The Epic in Film, From Myth to Blockbuster, argues. He says one of the first things he says is that the enduring popularity of the epic film can be explained largely by its ability to preserve and recreate mythical patterns and thus remain in touch with the deeper wishes of national identity. So there's that element of myth that's really, really important there. And that's always tied into the present. And indeed, James Russell, who wrote a book called The Historical Epic in Contemporary Hollywood, who actually broadens the definition of epic to include things like Dances with Wolves and so on. But he suggests that the cinematic epic takes as its subject world historical events. And these events must be treated epically, with the resources of cinematic style, approaching the effects of the epic in literature. Great events given the larger scale of treatment, great as in massive, but also connoting grandeur and overwhelming cultural significance. And this is why the epic film also comes and goes, because it's something that is tied in with what Hollywood very often is trying to do. And what cinema as a practice is trying to do. Cinema as a practice has always been associated with spectacle, and Steve Neal and Sheldon Hall's book Epics talks about the epic as spectacle, and that's a really important element of the representation of the ancient world. The ancient world has always been able to offer something that is spectacular. So when the cinema emerges, and this is Jeffrey Richards again, when the cinema emerged, he says they automatically turned to the ancient world, and scores of short films were produced with pocket versions of the familiar stories from the Bible, ancient history, and classical mythology. And indeed, Santos again agrees. From the outset, epic film, he says, has feasted on the collective myths of East and West, dipping into the inexhaustible resources of stories from the Bible, from Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian, Roman, and medieval cultures, and from Oriental and Eastern myths. So, when it comes to Hollywood using the ancient world, it has always found in the ancient world these incredibly attractive, massively important, and naturally spectacular myths. Sam Leith, in a recent article for the Financial Times, suggests that the attraction of classical antiquity to filmmakers has never been hard to fathom. It has sex, it has violence, and it has grand narrative. Greco-Roman antiquity, he says, offers filmmakers a giant out-of-copyright myth kitty. I think that's really, really important, because they are mythical retellings of the past that actually we completely miss if we look at it only from the perspective of accuracy. So this is why I want to look now at the question of accuracy versus authenticity. If we think about what a writer called Baird Sales suggests about epic films, he says most of these films are retellings of history. Much has been made of the laughable inaccuracy of cinematic recreation of the past, and certainly that is justified in some ways. If the films are considered as dramas rather than documentaries, poetic license is surely allowed in the production as well as story, in dialogue as well as characters. Now, that's really important, because one of the defences of the accuracy argument in film has been that films, even if they're narrative popular films, even if they're dumb Hollywood films, films need to films have to take responsibility for retelling the past in some sense of accurate or reliable historical way. This has been an assumption throughout history. So there's a very early letter in the 1930s by a historian, a prominent American historian called Louis Gottschalk, who writes to the head of Warner Brothers to say that they should stop making these historical films. We should stop making them, he says, because filmmakers have a responsibility to get the history right. Now, this is quite a curious claim if you think about it, because if those films never claim to be telling the history, why would historians be worried about them getting history wrong? And when we look at the real issues and the real anxieties underpinning all of this, we realise what the problem is. It's not that they're making these historical films, it's that people are watching them. And of course, more people are watching these films than are reading, the historical texts about the past and about the specific eras in which they're being set. So probably more people will be familiar with the world of Gladiator than will have studied the second century Roman Empire. 2nd century AD, that is, Roman Empire. And so a lot of the criticisms are on the basis of this kind of suggestion that historical films are somehow public history. And this is what Baird seals in that quotation I've just read out. He goes on to say, he says, in any case, much of the world's population knows what little it knows of history from these movies. And this is a really common claim. You'll find this in almost any work written between about 1980 and 2000. Almost any work on historical film or historical television will start off by saying it's important to get this right because most people are learning about the past through these films or these TV programs. Now, if we pause and consider what they're actually suggesting here, they're making an assumption that film has to be responsible. Now, I appreciate I'm saying this same point over and over again, but it's really, really important because that is the only justification for why these films need to be accurate. No one really talks about the same thing for science fiction films. We just accept that they are more fiction than science very often. But for some reason, historical fiction films that tend to get people really riled up when people get things wrong. For instance, if you look at the user reviews of certain historical films, and we can stick with Gladiator if you like, what we find is something very curious taking place where people will pick up on things that actually don't really matter. If anyone, I'm going to put an image on the screen, and I want you to have a think about it and see if there's anything that immediately jumps out at you as being wrong or ahistorical or problematic with this specific image. And it's obviously an image taken from Gladiator. In fact, given that you just watched Gladiator as part of your preparation for this lecture, I wonder if it jumped out at you at the time when you were watching it. Well, this is what one user has to say about that specific image from Gladiator on IMDb. He criticizes it not for its historical veracity, not for the clothing, but because the bars that you can see in the foreground have been made using modern electric arc welding rather than the specific metal joining techniques that would have been appropriate to the Roman era of the 180 AD. Now, this is an extreme example. It reminds me of when I went to the cinema to see Lord of the Rings, and you come out and there was someone behind me, and I guarantee this is true, who was telling their friend authoritatively that the armour was wrong for the period, right? You have to think, like, what period? When we're talking about that kind of level of criticism of accuracy, what we realise is that's missing the point entirely. And in fact, having the wrong kind of welding in Gladiator doesn't ruin the film at all for me. Even the fact that actually a lot of Gladiator is completely invented doesn't ruin the film because the film is doing something else. And this is why I try and distinguish between accuracy on the one hand and authenticity on the other. If you'd made suddenly, if the film Gladiator ends with Maximus jumping onto a Harley Davidson and riding off into the distance, that is an inaccuracy that is problematic for the tension, for the sort of the visual world or the narrative world of the film. If it's simply the wrong kind of welding that's being used in his holding cell, that's not ruining the tension of the film. So it's about the authenticity of the film in itself. The other point is that authenticity tends to be something that we as audience members recognize as being authentic. So if you think about where do we get that from, that comes from our own mythical capital. That comes from our experience of the past. So you, as classical scholars, will know much more about this era than the average person. And so therefore you will bring an extra level of knowledge to those films. But that means that your authenticity is different to mine. So it means that each viewer is approaching the film in a different way. So when we start moving away from accuracy on the one hand and moving towards authenticity on the other, what we realize we can do is we can stop looking at historical films and simply ticking off whether they got things right or wrong, but look at what they're doing and why they're doing it. Why would you get something wrong, especially if, as in Gladiator, we know that it's not in fact true? A good example of Gladiator is the ending of Gladiator, right? So I'm expecting you to watch this, so there shouldn't be a spoiler for you. And of course, the fact that Marcus Aurelius is killed by Commodus, right, which isn't really true, and that Commodus dies in the end in the arena fighting Maximus. This is not true at all, right? Commodus did die early and he was murdered, but he was murdered by a wrestler, and I think his name was Narcissus, actually, now that I think about it, but you can probably check that on Google. He was murdered in his sleep by a wrestler. Now, he was then succeeded, and I forget the name of his successor, but he was succeeded. The Republic was not restored. The entire narrative conceit of Gladiator is that Commodus dies and the Republic is restored in line with what Marcus Aurelius wanted as his dying wish. So the entire film is wrong, right? The ending of the film is completely wrong, completely disrespects the Roman tradition. If we're looking at through the prism of accuracy, then we dismiss the film and say it's useless and nonsense and doing something completely dangerous and whatever. But if we think about it and think about why, or what effect does it have that was wrong? Why would you end it differently? Considering these things are easy to Google, of course, even the late 1990s, it wouldn't be easy to Google, but these are easy to check. So why would you get something so basic so wrong? It must be because it is more narratively satisfying. And this is to think of historical film as an agent of change rather than anything else, right? And this is what I find a really, really useful way of thinking about the past, right? It's not that most of the world are learning their history from these films and therefore these films should get it right. It's that these films are using the past to make a story or a commentary on the present. If we start reviewing films from that perspective, from the perspective of authenticity rather than from the perspective of accuracy, we can actually get so much more out of it. It's like wringing a towel out to get just a little bit of extra out that we weren't expecting to get, because we suddenly realize these historical films can be used in two ways. One of which is just simply as a reverse. Rather than looking at historical films as films which represent a distant past, we can look at those historical films as films which capture the prevalent mood at the time in which the film was being made. So if you make a film in 1940s France, for instance, right, you're going to capture the feeling of French people, particularly under Nazi occupation, working predominantly in Parisian cinemas, and you're gonna if you see them making a historical film, you'll realize that their ideological perspective is inevitably going to be encapsulated within that film. So we get these films to become some kind of like time machines or what do you call them? Those time capsules, right, where people are burying their specific feelings. That doesn't mean that these films can only ever record their specific contemporary contextual political feeling or ideological feeling, but it does mean it's a really useful way of seeing it in that way. So you can see there's one way that those historical films tend to be unwitting recorders of national moods. The other point is that historical films can become agents of change in themselves. Those films can be used like Sergei Eisenstein's Alexander Nevsky, which is a film made about the medieval revolt of Russian. I think he was actually a Ukrainian Nevsky, it might have been Estonian, soldier who revolts against an invasion from abroad. This is at the time, of course, of the 1930s and the build-up of Nazi occupations and Nazi expansion in the late 1930s. And so this is Russia using its own past to predict in some ways the future, to bring about historical change, to inculcate a feeling of rebellion and national solidarity through the shared use of mythical capital and historical capital. So stepping away from the question of accuracy and the tired questions of accuracy debates allows us to see films differently. And this allows us to see films as what in media theory we would call uses and gratifications model. So uses and gratifications is a theory that suggests it's a way of moving away from media effects. So I'm going to just try and do it in a minute or so, because it's not necessarily relevant, but it's kind of important to where we want to get to, is the question of media effects, right? So there's a big theory that the media that we consume somehow makes us do X, Y, or Z. And we've seen this really, really frequently with violence, for instance. A shooter goes into a school and shoots a bunch of people. The immediate answer is always to say, well, have they seen any violent films? Yes, they saw a violent film, or more particularly recently played a violent video game, therefore these violent video games caused the violence. Right? This is a nonsensical argument on the basis that there is no evidence supporting it. We can't ever have any evidence, for a very complex reason. If you're interested, you can look at Justin Lewis's Ideological Octopus. The first 2 chapters of that explain why we will never actually be able to prove either way whether media has an effect or audiences. But certainly, they almost certainly don't, because no 2 audience members are alike. If we acknowledge that no 2 audience members are the same, then we recognise that the media cannot have a universal effect on everybody, for the very simple reason that everybody will be different and will respond in a different way. So uses and gratifications is a way around that model, is a way of thinking about historical media slightly differently, by questioning not what they do, but what pleasure or what use we get out of a specific media text. So why would you lie on the sofa and watch Friends, an episode of Friends that you may have seen 2, 3, 4, 20 times before? What pleasure would it give you? What use would it give you? We can't ever say that that episode of Friends is going to be having an effect on you, because of course the 20th time you see it will have a completely different effect from the first time that you see it. You might not laugh in the same way. You might laugh more because it's sort of more familiar to you, or you might laugh less because it's older or whatever. So the question is, what gratification does this serve? What kind of itch does this specific thing scratch? And so if we then move away from media effects and saying that these historical texts are teaching people X, Y, or Z, then we can actually move into slightly different territory and ask what gratifications they offer. So if we do start thinking about historical film and representations of the ancient world in film, not from the perspective of authenticity or not from the perspective of accuracy, but through the lens of authenticity, and specifically by asking what itch does it scratch, then actually we realise we're in very different territory indeed. So this is where we enter into the third part of the lecture, looking at Gladiator and the 21st century epic. So the arguments I'm going to suggest now could actually be applicable to, I suggest, if it works, any film within any of the 3 cycles I've discussed, the 20s and 30s, the 40s and 50s, and the 21st century return of the epic. But I'm going to specifically look at Gladiator, because it's very, very easy to see in Gladiator what it was that was so appealing perhaps to a lot of the audiences. One of the elements that is most striking perhaps about Gladiator is its reliance on the sense of spectacle. Now, people have been theorizing the relationship between spectacle and epic films for some time, but perhaps one of the most eloquent commentators on this was Vivian Sobchak in her argument that on the insistent fringe, which she talks about monumentalism as an element of spectacularity or spectacle in the epic's film. So by monumentalism, she means to say the way that a historical film or an epic film glorifies its past, it uses these kind of oversized sets, these oversized scenes of power and raw, undiluted power, is a way of criticizing those equivalents in the modern age. And that spectacle is pleasing to spectators, partly because it sort of celebrates the cinema in itself. So the return of the epic in the 1950s, for instance, is very often cited as a defense against the incursion of television, where television was invading more and more homes as they saw it, and so it was offering much more of a competition to the film, so the film does something that TV can't, i.e. spectacle. And there is a suggestion that CGI in the 21st century does the same thing for 5 years after we start seeing Sky and satellite channels dominating the domestic entertainment sphere, and we start seeing the plasma TV and the widescreens becoming more and more affordable, then we suddenly get these spectacular films that you can only really appreciate in the cinema as a way of defending cinema and TV. I think that argument is a little bit too simplistic, but broadly we can see it as kind of relevant. What we can see though is the ways in which spectacle is a part and parcel of the epic film. And Gladiator does this in two ways. One is it's spectacle in its own right, but two, it's deliberately and nostalgically recalling the image of ancient Rome in the cinema. So as Karl Maurer suggests, the Gladiator revives the spectacle of Roman corruption and debauchery so lavishly portrayed in earlier toga films. Why would you do that? Firstly, you would do it for nostalgia, kind of to prove your credentials, to show that you can do it not only the same as they did it in the 1950s, but better, right? Secondly, you would do it because over the course of the 1950s and 60s, what we started to see was an elision between the present and the past. In the era of, for example, the House of Un-American Activity, we see in the late 1950s, we see Spartacus emerge. Spartacus is written by Dalton Trumbo, who is a blacklisted writer. If you've seen the film Trumbo, you'll know what I'm talking about. Or indeed Hail Caesar. He's a blacklisted Hollywood writer, and he writes the screenplay to Spartacus, which is all about naming and shaming and refusing to give up the heroes in your midst. And this is in an era where people were indeed giving up names of members of the Communist Party. So we can read that film in a very specific way. We can also read a lot of epic films as critiques of power. And one of the first things that people started saying about Gladiator was not that Gladiator was ancient Rome, but Gladiator is America. So Monica Serino, who's a very well-respected classicist, writes in 2005 that the American spectators in the year 2000, supremely confident and unencumbered by doubts about their country's geopolitical dominance, experience not an indecisive tug or double-sided connection with ancient Rome, but rather a shock of recognition. The Romans depicted in Gladiator, she argues, undeniably stand in for us. Indeed, Jeffrey Richards agrees. In 2008, he writes, if the USA was an empire, what better way of flagging up these problems than a revival of that most imperial of film genres, the Roman epic? So, when we see that connection between Gladiator and America as a way of Franzoni, the screenwriter, and Scott, the director, to kind of critique the power or the hegemony, as Noam Chomsky would suggest, of American foreign policy, which was by the 1990s becoming increasingly unpopular and causing the populace, who were seeing a lot more reporting of war and bombings and so on, to become a little bit more uneasy with US foreign policy. So what we're seeing is this sort of uneasiness, and that emerges in 2000. And of course, this is immediately before 9/11, when US foreign policy would really start to become more problematic. And we can see that with Ridley Scott's next major epic film, which was Kingdom of Heaven, which explicitly talks about the Iraq invasion in 2003. So if we get what Serino is calling a shock of recognition, we can see that it's doing several things as well. It's critiquing power, but it's also critiquing excesses of power. And those excesses of power are buried, and they're buried very deeply but very powerfully within the cinematography. So if, for example, if we take the clip that I'm going to show you next, which is the triumphal entry of Commodus into Rome. So he's just come back from the death of Marcus Aurelius. He's just come back from the last Germanic war and entering Rome. So what we see is we'll see this aerial shot coming down through the clouds, and then a very well reconstructed ancient Rome. And this is what I've called elsewhere the epic zoom, where we come from on high and we sort of, it gives a suggestion of the establishing shot and authority, and entering Rome through the arch. Very, very familiar shots. And if we see the ways in which the crowds are organised either side to create a makeshift walkway through the forum, look at the ways in which the soldiers are an expression of power and hegemony. And now look at the ways in which Commodus is riding through the crowd just slightly higher, from left to right, and sort of supposed to be absorbing their adulation, even though this weirdly sped up sequence is actually suggesting that they're unhappy with him. Now, bear that in mind, that the crowd in this case it's not adulation that they're engaged in, it's opprobrium. Now we see this very, very important sequence where we're looking from the steps of the Senate, and we're looking at a low angle shot upwards towards the senators emerging in the togas, and suddenly we see out across what is basically St. Peter's Square with the Colosseum behind. Anyone who knows, and the Pantheon somewhere in the middle, anyone who knows Rome knows that that's not a shot that is actually possible architecturally or topographically of Rome. But what we're doing is we're seeing this concatenation of power, and then we see this powerful image of the soldiers lined up very, very clearly in regimented blocks, and we see the arrival of the emperor in between them. It's a raw expression of power, an expression of adulation, and we're supposed to disapprove of this this unfettered display of wealth, opulence, and military prowess, which we're suggesting isn't actually earned by Commodus. Now, I should do a content warning, because what I'm about to show you next is a very, very similar video, but this next video is actually the German labor rally at the Nuremberg rally in the Nazi occupation. This is from 1937. Now, if we see the ways in which that rally takes place, what we can see is, it's a very short clip. I'm just going to do some little clips of it, but what we can see is some startling and frightening similarities. The power so we start off with an aerial shot looking up at the planes going over through the clouds. That's actually very, very similar to that low angle shot we see coming through the clouds. Then we see an expression of military prowess through these tanks in a very, very well coordinated display. Now look at the ways in which Hitler climbs into the car slightly above the level of the crowds, and I've got in another video, which I'll show you in a second, there's an image of him riding along. When we cut to the light display here, we can see a really alarming display of power. This spectacle. This is again what Sobchak is calling monumentalism. It's not simply one person, and it's not simply a group of people. This is this massive, overwhelming, hegemonic sense of power, which is what Hitler and the Nazi Party were clearly going for, a way of showing that overwhelming and irresistible power. And then we see him drive off in the car in a shot-by-shot recreation, just going the opposite way to Commodus. So when we look at those two images, or those two clips, and we see undeniably a similarity. And Ridley Scott was a trained painter. He knows what he's doing. It's absolutely no doubt that he's modelling on Riefenstahl's filming of the Nuremberg rally. He very clearly knows what he's doing, and he's doing it deliberately to make a point. So remember when I said that there was a really important element about the disapproval versus the adulation? That is the area where I think we need to focus in on. Because actually the only difference between the two things is, one is that the crowd are supposed to be adoring Hitler in the Nuremberg rally, whereas in the Gladiator clip they're supposed to be rejecting Commodus. So by creating that kind of similarity, they're exploring hegemony, as Richards and Harty would suggest, and Kevin Harty has a discussion of Gladiator and American hegemony, which I'll try and copy as a PDF and put up online for you. But it also critiques the spectacle, and that's what Maria Weick is talking about, critiquing the spectacle and critiquing the hegemony and critiquing unchecked power. So the argument goes that if the US and its hegemony of the 1990s and relics of the 1970s and 80s is now the global superpower which is dominating, by using the ancient world as a kind of suggestion of unchecked decadence, and this is immediately before the fall of the Roman Empire, then you're creating a warning from history, and using the visual parallels, you're making multiple levels of historical criticism at the same time. So if we think about these waves then, and I want you to think about those more in your seminars and some of the questions that I've posed for you. If you think about those waves of these films going away and coming back again, and then aping successive periods in history, what we've got is nothing to do with accuracy. No one is suggesting that this actually happened. What we're doing is forcing us to confront the past and the lessons that we might learn from the past. So why do they come and go? They come and go basically because we need them for a specific thing. They're doing things that we need them to do. That then inaugurates a cycle where a lot of other films are being used to do all sorts of other things. And of course, we don't have time to explore each one, but Agada is a particularly interesting example of what happens when religious fundamentalism overtakes scientific rationalism. 300 is a very popular film, but if you think about what it's doing, it's actually deeply disturbing. It is massively problematic if you think about it in terms of its privileging of white, straight, male, able-bodied power. That kind of fantasy of the male body, which was also paralleled in Leni Riefenstahl's Olympia. If you look up the first 10 minutes, and I'll put the link on YouTube of Leni Riefenstahl's Olympia, you can see actually the parallel between some of the fetishization of the male bodies in 300 that Zack Snyder's done, and the fetishization of the male body that Leni Riefenstahl offers us in Olympia. Then I'm not really joking when I say this is an example of a fascist film that is unwittingly fascist. I'm not necessarily saying Snyder is a fascist when I'm saying these are fascist films that are being recreated because of the style and the spectacles and so on. But we also see the return of the biblical epic as well, and the biblical epic does a very interesting, some interesting work. So you could think of Risen, Noah, Pompeii, Exodus, and all of that cycle. They're also doing something quite exciting and something interesting. So if we move on to the conclusions then, my essential conclusion from this is to look at the epic film not from the perspective of what it's doing to the past, but what the past is doing for us. So it's most useful to think not in terms of accuracy, but in terms of the authenticity. What rings true about the ancient world that we see on screen? What are the dominating tropes and icons that become most familiar to us about the epic film? And so the epic film really isn't necessarily about history at all. It's not about literature at all. You get a few of these kind of direct adaptations, but they are not really anything to do with, but once we move away from those, and into the big epic films that are popular with audiences, then we actually start seeing there's a uses and gratifications model at work. It's not bad history, it's the history in many ways which we need to tell ourselves to comfort ourselves and make us feel better about the present and make sense of the present. So I think we're going to leave it there. I'll leave you some extra resources in the Blackboard site. If you have any questions, please do email me or bring them up with Maya in the seminars. And again, there's some questions in the seminar worksheet that should help you to work through some of these broader questions. Have a look at the reading, watch some extra films. There's lots of stuff on Bob, so use those resources, and I hope you enjoy your seminars.